Hello, everyone. Welcome. I trust you are really enjoying this conference today. Unfortunately, not in person, but today's session, the one that's starting now, will be about artificial intelligence and the creation of data spaces for the public good, and then more specifically on the privacy implications of the data sharing world. Euroforum has collected a really great group of panelists, and let me introduce them shortly to you. First is Deidre Clooney. She's a member of the European Parliament, and she's a full member of the Parliament's IMCO and a substitute member of the Parliament's Envy Committee. Deidre is a shadow rapporteur on the legislative proposal for AI Act for IMCO, and the two highlights worth mentioning are that she was recently the rapporteur on the report on developing an EU approach for digitization and AI, but she also worked on a report on the fundamental rights of the DSA. So welcome. Cornelia Cutterer leads Microsoft's European Rule and Law Responsible Tech team, which focuses on the impact of new technologies and regulatory frameworks that meet expectations of society. And the fun fact is that her kids are German, Belgian, and Spanish. So good news for the European Soccer Championships. Then we have Cecilia Alvarez Rigorias, and she's the EMEA Privacy Policy Director at Meta since 2019. And let me also share a fun fact about her, because she celebrates Thanksgiving since she was a child, and since her parents lived in the US many years, and brought some of the traditions back home to Europe. Then we have Christian Ancuna, and he works as the Data Policy and Innovation Unit of DG Connect and the European Commission. And he currently works on the implementation of the data strategy, in particular, the preparation of the Data Act proposal. And a fun fact about him to share is that he has a Portuguese name, he's actually Irish Indian and grew up in the south of London. And I think the correct pronunciation for that is Sarf. And then finally, Daniel Leufer. He works as a Europe policy analyst at Access Now's Brussels office. And he works on issues around AI and data protection with a focus on facial recognition and other biometrics. So let me close with a fun fact about him, that despite his Germanistic sounding name, he's actually Irish, and this often leads to awkward situations in which he gets emails in German and Dutch, or if people come up to him speaking those languages and assuming that he's a native speaker. So welcome, everyone. The way we are running the panel today is that everyone gets like 5 minutes for introductory remarks, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So I give the floor to Christian first.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be in this. It's a shame that it's only virtual, but it's great to be here anyway. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what we're doing in the Commission in the area of data and how it connects to the AI Act initiative proposal. I'll be very brief and general. So the European Commission has two big priorities. It's the green and the digital transformation. But if you look at when all of the various initiatives which are appearing now, where they originated, AI was one of the first. In fact, it predated the current college under President von der Leyen. When Thierry Breton came in as the digital commissioner for the internal market, he placed the emphasis on data. So you can't have leadership in AI without having data. And in fact, he goes beyond that now. If you listen to him, there's no point in having data if you don't have processing power, which is why we're working in DG Connect on the European Chips Act. Alongside all of that is the need for talent, for infrastructure, and all of these components were brought together in a communication from the Commission earlier this year called the Digital Compass, where we looked at skills, businesses, public administration, infrastructure, And indeed, within that was a series of targets, and one of them involves our aim for 75% of businesses across the EU to be using artificial intelligence and cloud services and big data, and by the year 2030. At the moment, the percentage is much lower than that. So how do we get to that? How do we achieve that target? One important element is the data strategy, which was published at the beginning of last year. And what you're seeing now is the implementation of this strategy. So last night, we were pleased to announce that that political agreement had been reached between the Parliament and the Council on the Data Governance Act. The Data Governance Act is the first big legislative component of the data strategy. What it's seeking to do is to create an environment for trusted data sharing, voluntary data sharing, and to support the development of data spaces across the economy. At the same time, we have the Digital Markets Act, which is also an initiative which is making very, very good progress through the Parliament and the Council, and that addresses concerns with certain behaviour in certain big players in the digital economy. Then we have the Data Act, which as Rob mentioned, I'm working on personally. That's going to be more about rights and obligations, clarifying who has the right to what data and what they can do with it. And all of this is supporting the development of data spaces. We have 410 million euro allocated to that under the digital work programme, the financial mechanism for this current financial period. Now, how does this all relate to AI? Well, of course, you can't develop AI systems if you don't have data, and so what we're trying to do is to create an environment where data can be shared, where it can be shared on the basis of trust and of European values, and that's crucial because if you look at a number of the way that this panel is described, there's almost an indication that somehow values are going to be an obstacle to digitalization and to economic growth in these areas. That could be further from the truth. If you look at what's happening in China, which many consider to be the leaders in artificial intelligence, they have now adopted a number of laws which are very, very stringent about what companies can do with data. But they're doing it on the basis of their values. And what we're trying to do in the EU is to say, well, data can be used. It has to be used responsibly. It has to be used in accordance with the GDPR. And that's why when you look through the AI Act, you can see a concern to preserve the role of data protection authorities, to preserve the right to human dignity and the right to privacy throughout the activities that we're trying to encourage. So that's an overview of what we're doing, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kickoff. Next, I'd like to invite Deidre for your first round of comments, please.
Yeah, good morning, Rob, and thank you. Good morning, everybody, and delighted to be partaking in the panel, and which I know the forum is going well. So hopefully it'll be informative and feed into the kind of work we're doing in the Parliament. And I suppose Christian has probably outlined a lot of where the work is at the moment. Parliament follows the Commission proposals. I am, as you mentioned, shadow on the AI Act in the Internal Market Committee. And I must say, from a Parliament point of view, well, we're behind the curve in the Council looking at this, because there was a dispute or a discussion over responsibilities. So now it's decided as of this week that the Internal Market Committee and the Libe Committee will jointly approach this file, the Artificial Intelligence Act. So, and that's good because we have clarity on how to move forward, and I hope we'll have some progress maybe towards the end of this year, and certainly early next year. We're due to have a hearing and discussion in our committee. I think it's next week. Yeah, the final week in this of committee work. So, and as you mentioned, the Parliament has already had a report, an INI report on artificial intelligence and how we like to approach it. So we absolutely support an awful lot of the Commission's work and what they have proposed. The risk-based approach is really important for Parliament, and we need to ensure that it, as mentioned, that it works coherently with other existing legislation, the relationship with the GDPR, medical devices regulation, machinery directive, those type of areas. We don't have overlap. And really a strong theme of the Parliament's approach so far has been to support innovation and whilst guarding against risks, but really want to see Europe leading in this area. And we probably match the Commission's ambitions on that as well as the Council, to ensure that there is a framework within which AI can flourish and can be used. But we need to build trust, and that's where the data comes in, and the use of data, the availability of data, trust and understanding. And I think that's very important, because if you're to build confidence, consumer confidence in AI and its use, where we certainly need to have that trust. So in a lot of areas that the Parliament would have addressed have been addressed by Christian also. The need for skills is really important, and education in this whole area. There's concern that regulators would have the capacity as well to regulate, and something will be changing and fast changing, because I'm conscious that regulation can be behind the real world in many instances. But and then the whole idea is to try and make the Act future-proofed, that it will be future-proofed and flexible, and it won't tie down so much. So I noted in the Council's draft that they have there's some information from that this week, that they've made some changes to the definition of AI. So we'll be looking at that and seeing how we can whether we'd agree or not with that. But on the whole, data, the data sharing is really important. I really think the fact that we had the Data Governance Act agreed this week between the Council and Parliament is very welcome, and that will set out how public data can be used, and that privacy of personal data is absolutely protected, but at the same time it can be used in certain areas. So to give that confidence, again, privacy will build trust, and also confidentiality from a business perspective. That's very important. So I think the right balance was struck there in that agreement. And so you have the AI Act, the Data Governance Act, and the next the Data Act, as Christian has said. On the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, the Parliament voted on its position last week on the Digital Markets Act, and we're due to vote on the Digital Services Act next week, all going well. So we're getting to a point now where we can have some agreement there, and can move on in the next 6 months after New Year under the French presidency to trialogues in those areas. But just going back to AI data, I think another theme that really was a real strong theme that came through on both on the health committee that I'm on as well, the Public Health Committee and the committee, the value of AI in healthcare and how it can improve, and sharing of information there. And we need a cross-border approach to it, because we do have a fragmented approach now. So the value of these regulations is that we can have a European approach, and benefiting patients, consumers, and European businesses. So on the whole, I would say from my point of view, and from what the inputs we've had from Parliament so far, this support for the AI Act. I want to see it implemented, and want to see a strong European approach reflecting obviously values and fundamental rights, and to have that human oversight in it as well. So tall order, maybe some might say, but I think we're confident to have a result pretty soon on this. So thank you for that, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Next, I'd like to invite Cornelia for your opening words, please.
Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks for being in this panel. It's obviously a super timely panel, given that the Parliament has now chosen the responsible committees to advance the legislative process in the Parliament side, and the Slovenian presidency has worked on a first compromise proposal for a certain amount of articles within the AI Act, so timely discussion to dig into these issues. Of course, there is many other topics that relate to this, such as the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, the DMA, the DSA. I will not go into these at the moment. I will focus a little bit more on where we are coming from in relation to the AI Act, and we're eventually already commenting a little bit on what we think of the Slovenian presidency compromise proposal. So first of all, I'd like to say that we have started to look at the AI Act in particular based on the learnings that we have gained through operationalizing responsible AI in our services. We've, over the last 3 years, built out a responsible AI governance model, which includes a number of new departments, in particular the Office of Responsible AI, in which a new standard is developed that our engineering groups have to comply with. That standard really looks at the ethical principles. As a reminder, those are very similar to those that were developed by the high-level group on AI and endorsed by the European Commission. But then they are high level and they need to be put in practice by engineering groups. So you have to sort of layer them down into very concrete outcomes and goals and objectives that engineering groups have to achieve. That's the one thing. And we do this for all our AI systems, which relates to a comment that I would like to make later on how important the code of conduct area will be in this space. Similar to previous speaker, we are also thinking that at the moment a high-risk approach is definitely the right approach, focusing on where we know there are risks, and then really getting the legislation right so that we can build on this. And we therefore also think that the model that the Commission has built sort of to continue evaluating as the technology grows is the right one to stay ahead of the pace of technology development. The one area that we were struggling with is the equation between products and AI systems. So what the Commission has been doing is basically grounding the overall legislative framework on product safety systems that we already know from the new legislative framework. And that brings in a number of specific issues, one of which is, for example, that providers or component providers, that they often make AI models available as general purpose AI services that are put to use in customer-defined applications, or customers combine multiple AI systems or components, or AI services that can be customized with customer data that are dynamic. And last but not least, AI services are becoming more general capable. So the end use is largely defined by what the AI Act describes as user. And in addition to that, we need to understand that the particular AI systems that are used to augment services to customers, citizens, or consumers that create risks to fundamental rights are socio-technical in nature. So they concern the capabilities and limitations of the technology combined with the people's expectations of it and the social context of its use. So within the context of the use of AI systems, humans play an important role the specific intended use by the user plays a specific role, and the circumstances in which it is used plays an important role. So while the provider of the technology will understand best the design and the development of the use, it is the deployer or user of the AI system that is closest to the societal context. So what we're really saying here is that the allocation of responsibilities may make sense for product safety risks for physical products. Those risks are relatively consistent across deployment scenarios, but this is seldom the case in the context of services that can be used for multiple situations. So the allocation of responsibilities is really one of the most important areas that we need to discuss in more detail. The user in the AI Act is largely reduced to following instructions by the provider, and it's just not reflecting the reality of how AI systems are developed. Our second recommendation that we think need to be in particular looked at are the adjustments of the AI Act's requirements that should much more be focused on outcomes and processes. Currently, they are very much explained as technical requirements, such as accuracy or error-free data. But often, the different requirements that you can sort of link back to the principles of fairness and reliability, inclusion, etc., they need to be much more focused on the outcomes. They are currently written in a way that will be hard for engineers to implement. Think about what error-free data means and what do you actually measuring against it. And this measurement question certainly came up in our conversations with our researchers that focus on how to implement ethical principles through accountability objectives or fairness goals. So here there are different ways to think about how this could be done. For example, you could say, if you think about fairness, high-risk AI systems should provide a similar quality of service for relevant demographic groups impacted by a system. That would be something which is very precise and really focuses on the area that potentially could crystallize a risk. Or, for example, another one is high-risk AI systems that describe, depict, or otherwise represent people, cultures, or society should minimize the potential for stereotyping, demeaning, or erasing relevant demographic groups impacted by the system. This would be another way of formulating the requirements in a way that allow the engineers in the development phase to mitigate potential risks. And of course, these potential risks might appear in the development phase, but it also has to be taken care of in the deployment phase. So there needs to be also accountability and transparency when the system is deployed in the specific context. And I think here we probably align with a demand that civil society has made, that it needs to be closer to the accountability, needs to be closer to the potentially impacted citizens. And with that, I will stop here for a second.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Then I'd love to hear the introduction of Cecilia, please.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much for the organization for inviting me to be in this incredible panel. I think that we live in a world where AI is increasingly behind most of the products and services that we are using every day, from finding directions in a map, using a chatbot to get the doctor's appointment, or getting new film or music recommendations from an app, to name a few services that now we are so used to have. AI is a core technology for many organizations, and this is not an exception for Meta, where this is something that is, to take just the example of the social media, is something that is essential in order to be able to provide and deliver the personalized experience that the users are contracting, and also to facilitate jointly with human review how to enforce our community standards against illegal or harmful behaviors, including hate speech or misinformation, bullying, or promotion of suicide or self-harm. Despite or in addition to this evident social dimension of being connected with people that are close to you, or causes that you care, or businesses on which you are interested, there are other areas in which Meta also invest in using AI that also has a social and economic impact. And in particular, I'm referring to the Data for Good program, which aims to empower governments and NGOs, researchers, and think tanks with privacy-preserving data to advance social and economic issues. Since, unfortunately, we are still in I don't know which is the phase of the pandemic, but one of these phases which has prevented actually us to meet personally. I can maybe raise one example that has been meaningful with respect to how the data could be used for good. The Data for Good mobility and population data has been leveraged by the range of government agencies in the European Union to better tailor their stay-at-home policies, such as the National Statistics Agency in Portugal that use Meta mobility data for the national COVID-19 response, authoring monthly press releases using data to monitor how mobility was being affected during the lifting of restrictions and the reopening of schools. The same happened with respect to the Joint Research Commission of the European Commission, who leveraged our population density map to develop mobility functional areas. And this study was focused on the link between COVID-19 pandemic and these mobility functional areas in Austria. And to finish with this particular example, the Ministry of Innovation in Italy has also used the COVID-19 dashboard that was developed with Meta mobility data and built by the University of Pavia as an input for the national strategy to tackle the pandemic. These are part of the opportunities that AI may offer by using responsibly data. And to be able to address these opportunities in a responsible manner, I think that many organizations, and again, Meta is not an exception, has been trying to incorporate certain number of standards in order to guide the process. Not necessarily that we are going to anticipate all the issues, but definitely I think is a good start. And this has been largely inspired by principles that have been agreed at the OECD level and also in the High Observatory of the European Commission on AI. And in this sense, to address these topics, Meta's work on responsible AI has been organized around 5 pillars, starting with privacy and security, followed by robustness and safety. The third one is fairness and inclusion. The fourth one, transparency and control. And the fifth one, accountability and governance. And something that the 5th pillars may have in common is that there is a combination of technology and human processes that are behind. If I may focus on the privacy and security, there are specific privacy review process that are cross-product that involved the identification of how the collection and use and sharing of people's information are identified and mitigation risks are addressed. But this is also linked to another way of addressing also privacy, which is not only through processes that addresses the life cycle of the data in the AI processes, but also how to develop technology that helps us in this process. And Meta is investing, as many other companies, in privacy-preserving machine learning technologies that has actually been used also in the Data for Good examples that I mentioned before. If I take now robustness and safety, the second pillar, it happens the same. So AI technology is used jointly with human reviewers in order to be able to address the enforcement of this illegal or harmful behavior that we have been identifying, and something that goes against our human values, but also our business needs. So it is not at odds but just the contrary, that we have a safe platform in order that the business continues to be growing. Fairness and inclusion, again, is another perfect example in which we have a lot of focus with respect to how we have good representation with respect to the data set, but also good representation in terms of inclusion regarding the human reviewers that are going to participate in the AI processes, as well as developing technology. Again, in particular, we have a fairness flow, which is a technical toolkit that enables meta teams to analyze how some types of AI models and labels perform across different groups. It's a diagnostic tool, so it cannot resolve fairness concern on its own, but it enables, let's say, the process to address how fairness can be ensured the best that we can in the context that we can control. Because as Cornelia was mentioning, the context is not just when the product is developed, it's also when it is used, not only by the company, but as the case may be, by other actors that can incorporate these AI models in their own systems, or the users that are not necessarily in a passive role. I will move to the last point that I would like to make with respect to an element also that Christine D'Acunha was mentioning, how necessary are the data in order to be able to be successful with AI. Definitely data are the backbone of leveraging emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. And I will go even a bit further, as other panelists have been mentioning, with respect to the importance of the data sharing in a responsible manner, in order that we are able to unlock the potential of AI technology. And this, of course, encompasses international data flows and not only European data flows. And I believe that AI and data flows are an opportunity for democracies to show the world that innovation and human rights go hand in hand in the face of other alternatives, regimes that are not necessarily reflecting our values. And in this context, I truly hope that the successful negotiations between the EU and the US will also be key and essential to resolve the uncertainty and legal risk for many organizations in the private sector and in the public authorities as well, and to be the starting point for this wider conversation. I will leave it here for next engaging in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So indeed, before we are going to have the discussion on the opening statements, I'd like to give Daniel the opportunity to also make some comments, please.
Hi, and yeah, first to say just thanks for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel speaking about such an important topic at a really key moment. For those of you who may not know, Access Now is a global human rights organization that works to protect and extend the digital rights of people at risk around the world. We've been working on AI throughout the legislative process, right from the high-level expert group, where your policy director, Fanny Hedvegi, was one of the members, and have been providing inputs throughout the whole white paper process and all of the consultations. Given the topic that we're talking about today, I'd like to do a little bit of an intro on the relationship between AI and data. Because we often hear in the sort of lobbying language that's being thrown around and in some of the high-level statements that, you know, more data leads to better AI, that anything that restricts data flows, data collection, data processing gets in the way of AI development. This is thrown around a lot, and it's definitely not true. So I'd basically like to back up Christian's statement that, you know, values are not an obstacle to AI development, but actually an essential bedrock for it to happen in a positive way. To give one example, that's is also very relevant for the health context. If we look at chatbots, there's been massive progress in chatbots recently, and there's all sorts of use cases being proposed that to have medical chatbots to help with overloaded health systems, and this is definitely a very high risk use case. And I would point out that in the AI Act, in the Annex 3 list of high risk use cases, there is no heading for health applications, and I think that's something that we maybe need to think about. And I'll give you an example of why. What is generally considered one of the most advanced general purpose AI systems in the world is GPT-3, which was developed by OpenAI, and if I'm correct, Cornelia, is under exclusive license by Microsoft. And GPT-3 is a machine learning system, very complex one that's trained on a lot of data scraped from all corners of the internet, and has been shown in many instances to regurgitate the worst aspects of some of those corners of the internet that the data was scraped from, including spouting racist abuse and all sorts of awful things. Now, in the medical context, I think a French outfit called Nabla used GPT-3 to build a medical chatbot. And when it was asked by a fictional patient whether it should commit suicide or not, it responded that it's probably a good idea for the patient to commit suicide. And this points to serious flaws with that, large language model approach to developing chatbots, especially for sensitive domains, that they can often produce very realistic conversations, but there's almost no control over the type of outputs that they produce. And I would contrast this with Mitsuku, which I think is now called Cookie, which is a 5-time winner of the Leufer Prize Turing test for best conversational chatbot. And when it won the competition in 2020, it was largely reported on in the media as a victory for machine learning based approach. And the creator, Steve Borswick, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, actually had to come out and say there's no machine learning in Cookie and Mitsuki. It's an entirely rule-based system, did not use any data to build it. It's hand-coded by him. So the idea that this big data approach is the only approach for all applications is not strictly correct. And there are some particular risks that come with some of these general purpose large language models. This is, of course, not to say that there aren't massive benefits from these approaches, but just to push back a bit on the idea that that's the only approach that's going to get us anywhere. Also, we often hear that AI has been extremely successful in combating COVID. But I would point out that there are 2 studies that show something of the opposite. One study, which analyzed 232 diagnostic algorithms developed to diagnose COVID, showed that none were fit for clinical use and only 2 showed promise. Another study that looked at 415 such algorithms showed that, again, that none of them were fit for use. Now, this is not to say, and those studies do not conclude, that AI cannot be useful in this situation. But what they did show is that the poor data quality, sloppy data collection, all of this very bad quality data, and in some cases badly designed algorithms, produced very problematic outcomes and could lead to serious harms if they were actually used in a clinical setting. And the point that I want to make is that a data free-for-all will not get us to quality AI. We often hear things like China has access to all of this data, and so they can speed ahead in this purported AI race, which we could say a lot about. But that is not the case. What we need is high quality data. Data maximization will not lead us to high quality AI. What I would stress here is that data protection is an essential baseline to developing quality AI. So the idea that the GDPR gets in the way of AI development is completely wrong. The actual case is that some applications of AI pose a threat to our rights, and the GDPR protects us there. And actually using that as a baseline will get us to much better AI systems. Also, to come now to the AI Act, and just to say a few things about that. The obligations that the AI Act places on providers and users of high-risk AI systems, and I will just say here that civil society is also of the opinion, along with what Cornelia said, that there are too few obligations placed on users of high-risk AI systems, because a huge amount of the risk actually develops in the context of use. And we have some recommendations on how that could be improved there. But the type of obligations that are placed on developers and users of high-risk AI systems are also not getting in the way of innovation. They're ensuring responsible development practices. And given that our goal and one of the pillars of the Commission's approach is to promote AI uptake, but we don't just want more AI. I mean, people won't trust bad AI if dodgy systems that don't work are thrown out there. They will undermine innovation. They'll undermine adoption. So we really need quality stuff to be put out there, and that's of the utmost importance in these high-risk scenarios. So what we need to do is ensure that when there is this possibility of really threatening our rights, that real responsible processes are enforced. We can't just rely on them to be followed voluntarily, and we really need transparency. This came up again in those two meta-studies that I mentioned of COVID diagnostic algorithms. There was often a complete lack of transparency from the third parties who were providing these systems to hospitals and to doctors. And we really can't have that in these situations. We need a very high level of transparency on how these work. I will just also finish by saying that it's also not always about privacy. So obviously it's a massive thing in the context of AI in health because we're using sensitive personal data. But privacy isn't the only right that's impacted. And here I would point to emotion recognition systems, for example. There's currently very few obligations placed on emotion recognition systems in the AI Act. But the European Data Protection Supervisor and European Data Protection Board, in their joint opinion on the AI Act, called for a prohibition on the use of emotion recognition systems. This is something that we have been arguing for a long time. Many civil society actors and academics have also argued for this. There are many reasons emotion recognition systems are incredibly invasive. They undermine the very essence of our privacy, so privacy is relevant here. But in the EDPS-EDPB joint opinion, they argued for an exception for medical uses, and I think this is extremely problematic, and it again points to the problem that health use cases are not listed as a high-risk area in the AI Act as it currently stands. Now, the real problem with emotion recognition systems at the moment is not only that they don't work, that they invade our privacy, but that they don't work. There is very bad, very poor, and really a lack of scientific evidence for the ability of these systems to infer things about our emotions. So having an exception in a prohibition for use in a medical context is really dangerous. A medical context is going to be a very high-risk context, and we don't want shoddy systems that don't really work to be used there. Again, that will completely undermine the intention to build an ecosystem of trust and excellence. So I'll finish there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think we've heard a lot about the different data instruments that are actually being developed. Some aimed at opening up data, others are more aimed at correcting market imbalances. I think it's also good, before we start the discussion, to understand and to remind that there are many types of data involved here as well. It's not just about personal data. There's also much discussion on non-personal data. And some of that data is private sector data, but there's also public sector data. So looking at different perspectives and trying to open up the discussion, let me turn to Deidre first with a question. Can you tell us a little bit about the potential benefits of AI for healthcare in general, and also about the importance of the use of healthcare data, especially for health research?
Yeah, okay, thank you. And just bearing in mind Danielle's comments now, but yes, I think, well, healthcare is really important. The more, obviously, quality data is important, and the more you have, the better decisions you can take. So it's we've seen that AI can really respond to challenges from aging population, demand for services, increase in cost for healthcare as well. and can empower patients well by helping them monitor their own health. So that can be important, and also it's important to research, because the more data you have, the more obviously the better the outcomes. Not taking from the fact that it's the quality data that you need. So we had a number of hearings in Parliament, and this particularly in the area of cancer, and it came up time and time again. The limitations or the restrictions of GDPR, and the need to get access to that data from a public health point of view, respecting privacy of the individual, but at the same time making that data available for research and for medics, for surgeons, for practitioners right across Europe. So there's a real benefit in sharing of that information and making sure that data is shared, because you've got different types of data, diverse range across Europe. So to get kind of a non-diverse approach to it, making sure that you get the same data, that it's delivered in the same way, but that you do have a bank of data that's available and for use in healthcare areas. And I think the Data Governance Act that we've had agreed, hopefully, and we'll get it through Parliament, it will be agreed by Parliament, I would expect finally the final outcome, that'll allow for more use of data for public use for healthcare. I think it's going to be really important in that area. So it's one of the strong, not taking from the fact that I think it's we've got to be really confident of the quality of the data that we're using, where it's coming from, and where approaching it with caution, but recognizing the importance that it can have in addressing many of the problems we have in healthcare.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Christian, because one of the things that in your introduction that resonates with me is about product safety. Obviously, we've seen the conformity assessment and standards. Recently, there was also already a conformity assessment for Internet of Things. And if I looked at that document, there was very little on privacy, very little on the correct terms in terms of GDPR, how to identify risks, how to do proper tests. Maybe you can say a few words on how this actually will play out. And this ties into the question which was addressed. There's a gap between how engineers look at product safety and conformity and testing versus how lawyers look at more open norms and open terms like fairness, etc.
Thanks. It's a good question. I think the decision, the idea behind the construction of the AI Act was that we have in place the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have the GDPR. There's no question whatsoever that whenever personal data is processed, it has to be lawful and fair, and it has to be in conformity with the GDPR. And the competent authorities, the data protection authorities, they remain fully competent to enforce that. But what we've done with the proposal is that we've built onto that, or made a connection to general product safety rules, on the basis that these are the AI systems are in effect products which are entering the market, and it's been ambiguous over the last few years to what extent they have to conform to basic safety rules, and those go beyond what is required as a data controller or a data processor when personal data is involved. So we've tried to harness this accepted and understood sort of product safety framework to ensure that when AI systems enter the market in the future, that they don't create or reproduce bias, but they help to reduce it. For example, where there are high risk systems, that they're trained and tested with a sufficiently represented data set, that data is traceable and auditable when it's used to train an algorithm, etc. These are all areas which are not really covered by the data protection framework. the connection with what we're trying to do with the data strategy, and it goes really to the point that Daniel was, one of the important points that Daniel was making about data quality, and getting rubbish data from around the world, which is just going to corrupt the overall product and result in horrendous outcomes. What we're trying to do is to ensure that there is a trusted environment in European data spaces for data to be used to train AI systems which are of a high quality and are not going to reproduce or exacerbate bias. So that's basically the idea, and that's why I think it's important that you bring together the data spaces concept with the AI initiative in the title of this panel. So I hope that goes some way to answering your point.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me turn to Cornelia, because you touched on the importance of code of conduct. So maybe against that background, what's, from your point of view, is the rationale behind in the AI Act towards product safety approach?
Well, I think I can't speak for the Commission. I don't know. It's a question probably for Christian what the rationale is. When I look at it, and of course because AI is so new, and having been participating in the reflections from the white paper to the adoption of the proposal, you can take. I mean, if you're starting with something new, and usually when you have something new in front of you, you start from what you know, and there are different models you could think of in how to structure the responsibility framework around AI. There's of course Annex 2, which is largely around products, product safety legislation, the product safety legislation framework. And then there's Annex 3, and when you look at the scenarios in Annex 3, they're fundamentally different from Annex 2. In Annex 2, AI systems are embedded a part of a product. In Annex 3, the AI systems are supporting services or people that make decisions in the context of services that are delivered either from the public sector or in the context of commercial use cases, such as in the banking sector, or in mixed, could be education, etc. And the Commission, I believe, wanted to have horizontal rules for all the different systems. Now, in the specificity, it works, of course, for Annex 2, but it's very complicated because we're dealing with very different risks that materialize very differently in Annex 3. And so I think this one size fits both Annex 2 and 3 doesn't really work that well. The Slovenian presidency has now to a certain extent addressed this by adding a new article that focuses particularly on general purpose AI systems. So much of the language models that were referred to by Daniel, or vision recognition, these are models and that are general and then are used for very different purposes, further developed, integrated in a more complex AI system, etc., etc. And so here, the Slovenian presidency's proposal is to say, well, they are not created with a specific intended purpose, but rather it is the user that describes the intended purpose, and so we are entirely in a different world of than that from product safety. It's also, I mean, without boring audiences with specific articles, but it's really interesting that Article 24, for example, that refers specifically to Annex 2, considers the manufacturer, so the user of the AI system, as the provider. And then Article 28 shifts provider and user responsibilities depending on the whether or not the user is deviating from the instructions of the provider. And now we have Article 52A, which focuses on general purpose. So when you step back, you're wondering whether this basic rule, the provider takes care of all the requirements, is actually still making sense. And where we are coming from is, of course, we are developing. When we are developing and developing the technology, we do these things according to our own standards that we have developed. So there is data documentation requirements, there is accountability and transparency requirements. There's at the beginning a risk assessment, which is quite holistic. So really thinking about the potential abuses, the potential impacted stakeholders, those who are actually benefiting from it. And we do this generally. And this brings me back to the importance of codes of conduct that I believe will have to be developed to cover a broader variety of use cases that might not be considered high risk, but you might still want to have some sort of responsible AI governance around it. In our case, for example, we actually, through that system, identify sensitive use cases or risk use cases where we specifically look at how they can be mitigated, whether we can contract with a specific customer or whether a specific system is, for example, not yet ripe for certain use cases. So yes, I believe that, and we have always advocated for this, that the Commission should bring in incentivizing a more general governance for trustworthy AI.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Cecilia, we touched in preparation of this panel on the potential standards to identify AI challenges. Maybe some words from you in that context, because it builds a little bit on what we've discussed so far.
Thank you very much, Rob. I would like in this connection to address this idea of the high quality of the data that has been addressed beforehand, and in particular with respect to the Commission's proposal when linking the bias with the mandate of having the data that are relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete. And I think that it will be worth that we address a certain number of things that are not binary. The first idea will be that the bias does not come exclusively from the input data. Definitely, this is something that could happen as well. There are examples of different things, but it's not that every example that we have of data that are not understood as high quality will have horrendous outcomes, if I may borrow the expressions that were used beforehand. Bias in data sets are certainly a problem and need to be addressed, in part through a thoughtful data collection and curation practice. But we need also to be conscious that data could be perfectly accurate and also reflect structural and societal biases. Or we may have also AI developers that can make assumptions during the design of the system as to how they expect the systems to be used, and as a result, the system may also exhibit bias. So when thinking about how we address bias, we need to maybe understand better what we think about what means data to be complete, whether we can achieve this, and if we can, whether this is actually the best way to address bias, because the most important thing is to understand the objective in order to be able to analyze as to whether the tools that we are making are actually suitable for this objective. Definitely the input data are relevant, but they are also relevant with respect to the building or the system in the overall, and also with respect to the outcomes. And we should be then probably considering in a more holistic manner both the inputs and the outcomes, recognizing that error-filled inputs can still lead to fair outcomes. I'm not saying always, but this is something that happens. Just as error-free inputs can still lead to unfair outcomes, that also we have examples on this kind. It is in many cases very difficult to understand what free of errors or complete would mean, in particular, if this is data that are collected about real-world people and real-world things, that as it happens, they are normally not error-free. And this is true both for data sets that are used in supervised and unsupervised learning. If I may think about the supervised learning, models are typically trained on pieces of data that are individually labeled by human annotators, and this may introduce two forms of potential error. First, when there is a clear agreement on what the label for any given element should be, human annotators will make mistakes, particularly when trying to efficiently label hundreds or thousands of items. But even when this human error in annotation would be eliminated in hypothesis, we cannot eliminate the fact that in many cases there is no clearly correct label. I remember that when I joined Meta, I was participating in an exercise with human rights experts, independent and outside of the organization, from the different continents of the world. And we were trying to do the exercise of being this kind of human annotators in order to train an AI model in order to address hate speech. And it is surprising, or maybe not that surprising, but definitely it opened my eyes to see that with people that were experts, coming from different parts of the world, and they were trying then to see representative and having an inclusive environment. The rules that each of the groups came with respect to what they consider hate speech, with respect to images and captions and text, were definitely different. So the correct label was definitely not something that we should assume that we can take it for granted in every context. If I move to the unsupervised learning, it's a labor-intensive process that the functionality is limited by the capacity of human laborers to apply the correct labels to each element in the data sets. If I think of a language model that may use billions of examples of written language, far more than human annotators could provide, this data might contain typos, poor grammar, or maybe other errors. But given enough data, the model may still learn the correct spelling and grammatical structure of the language. If the AI foreclosed the use of imperfect data sets in this sense, this would de facto prohibit the use of unsupervised learning, which would be a significant impediment to AI innovation. Similar problems may happen with respect to this idea of error-free, and maybe I may use another example with respect to the use of synthetic data that are not real data, but because they are not real, are they going to be considered accurate? Synthetic data will be something that maybe will address better principles that we have in the GDPR, such as data minimization. It may also address bias in the sense of introducing or correcting structural systemic bias that we have in real world, or just make available data sets that do not exist in the real world. It could be in very different kind of scenarios. And finally, thinking also of this error-free, when we think about privacy-enhancing technologies, and in particular differential privacy, in which you introduce noise in order to protect the re-identification of the data, actually this is an error that you introduce, is an error that is controlled in order to enable to facilitate that you conserve or you keep the scientific value of the data. But the fact is, this is an error that you're introducing in the system. So I think they are, as I am trying to say, that the things are not binary, that they are examples, of course, of terrible results, but also examples of wonderful results. As it's not necessarily that we are making the cost consequence so clearly as in a binary, let's say, representation.
Thank you, Cecilia. There's like one question that's on top of my mind, and it's GDPR related. And maybe I can connect that question to the one that was posed by one of the attendants in the audience. And the question is, how will potential overlap with other authorities and certification bodies be avoided And I'd like to connect this to the question, do you think the GDPR needs to be redesigned to foster data sharing? And maybe, Christian, you have some thoughts on these two aspects.
Yeah, it's a topical question. I think at the same time that as this conference, there's a competing one where Commissioner Jourova has been saying that the GDPR has to succeed and be enforced. Otherwise, we need to look at it again. But there's nothing in the GDPR which stops you from processing data in a lawful and fair way. It's incredibly flexible. It might be interpreted in a way which prevents you doing what you want to do. But at the same time, it can also be interpreted in a way which enables data to be used in a harmful way, which is why we need to have, consistent and coherent enforcement. So there's absolutely nothing in the GDPR which says you can't use data to train your AI. And in fact, the GDPR is in many ways replicated around the world now. Even in China with PIPA, they have laws which say you have to have lawful basis and safeguards when you're processing personal data. So it really is a red herring. Now, on the question of enforcement authorities, if you look at Article 59 of the AI Act proposal, it goes into some detail about national competent authorities needing to be sufficiently staffed with the right resources, and also it goes into some detail about the skills that they need, in-depth understanding of AI, data and data computing, fundamental rights as well. If you compare that with the equivalent article in the GDPR where it says member states have to set up a data protection authority, it's more detailed in the AI Act, and so I think there's clearly on the table there is a demand that enforcement will be enabled effectively.
Thank you very much, Christian. Also, to give everybody a little bit of balance in the speaking time, I'd like to ask Daniel whether he wants to add some thoughts to this topic.
Yeah, for sure. I think just on that last point about the enforcement bodies, there is definitely some detail in there, talking about what types of expertise these bodies are going to need, but I do think we need to maybe increase that. If I remember correctly, it specifies that there should be between 1 and 25 staff members, and I think 1 is definitely too low, so we need to increase that. I'll just come back to a recommendation that Access Now and Algorithm Watch made jointly in response to the white paper on AI, which was for the establishment of national centers of AI expertise. And because one thing that we recognized at the time was that the protection of people's rights and the enforcement of any type of AI regulation will necessarily be something that falls on many different bodies. And this is reflected in Article 64 of the current proposal, where it allows bodies responsible for the protection of fundamental rights to have access to all documentation created throughout the conformity assessment process, and if necessary, to test individual systems. That's great, but they need resources to do that. And I think that Article 64 is an acknowledgement of the fact that, different types of high-risk AI systems, different types of AI systems will impact different rights and will inevitably fall under the jurisdiction of different enforcement bodies. So having something like a national body that provided the types of expertise needed for any different body could make use of would be one way of doing that, rather than having to staff all of them individually with extra expertise. So I think we really need to think about that, and not just in terms of the one single body, but how we can enable all the different implicated bodies to do their work there.
Thank you, Daniel. And also, in sake of the time that we have, I'd like to give the final closing thoughts to Deidre.
Okay.
And anything you'd like to bring up on top of what we've heard so far?
No, apart from, it's been most interesting, the contributions. As it started out, the Parliament we're now ready to start on our journey on this. And many of the issues that have come up to liability certainly be, where does liability fall? Certainly something that we considered and will be considering. And also the oversight, the European Artificial Intelligence Board, and how will that act? I think, you know, again, at the point that I'm very concerned about came up in our own report as well, having the relevant expertise and competence to oversee this is going to be very important to be, if we can. Well, I don't think we can ever be ahead of the game, but to be certainly that is going to be important, the oversight and making sure, you know, basics that that the fundamental rights are protected, that there is a human oversight. That's important. And again, focusing on high risk, and of course, as from all our discussions here, is the quality of the data is going to be really important to make sure we get that right. But I do think, you know, the Data Governance Act and access to data now is important, the Data Act itself, and how we interact with the GDPR, the medical devices regulation, and that is going to be important. And that's the next number of months. That's the work in place for us in the Parliament, and I've no doubt we'll be engaging with those on the panel and as well in the forum today on that and in shaping our own input.
Well, thank you very much, Deidre. Also, Cornelia, Cecilia, Christian, and Daniel. Next will be a lunch break, and this will then be followed by a keynote speech at 2:15. And with that, I'd like to wrap this panel up. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.